Hello, everyone. Good morning for those of you joining us in the United Kingdom. Good evening for those of you joining us in Asia. And a very good morning for those of you in the United States. My name is John Nilsson Wright. I'm the Career Foundation Fellow here at Chatham House and also Senior Fellow in Northeast Asia and also Associate Professor at the University of Cambridge. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to our South Korea Presidential Election Watch webinar. I'm delighted to be able to welcome three very distinguished participants for what I'm sure is going to be a very timely event. The election is just about 2 days away from us. Before I do introduce our speakers, let me remind you all that this event is taking place on the record. We will have some very short presentations from our individual speakers, and then we'll have an exchange of views for about 20 or 25 minutes between myself and the panelists. And then for the remainder of our time, I'm going to open it up to Q&A from all of you. If you do have questions, please, in the characteristic fashion, submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, not the chat function. And if you are interested in asking your question directly rather than having me read it out, please also indicate that so that we can then ask you to engage directly with our panelists. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers in the order that they're listed on the outline for today's discussion. Christian Davis is the Financial Times Bureau Chief and Correspondent in Seoul. Prior to that, he was based in Warsaw. He's just written, I think, a very timely piece on the election, which I recommend to you all. And I think we'll be able to put that in the chat feature so that you'll be able to look at that either now or after our discussions. And then Eric Mogrand, who is Career Policy Chair at the RAND Corporation. He's joining us at a very early hour from the West Coast of the United States. Eric is also a professor at Seoul National University, and for the purposes of our discussion, the author of Top-Down Democracy in South Korea, a book that I will strongly recommend to you if you want an understanding of some of the complexities of democratic politics in the Republic of Korea. And last but not least, my old friend, Kathy Moon, Chair of Asian Studies at Wellesley College, and also Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., where she was from 2014 to 2016, the Career Foundation inaugural chair. So three panelists with together a wealth of experience watching Korean politics, Korean history, and of course the contemporary Korean scene today. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over first to Eric to talk about the context. And I'll just want to say, for my own purposes, a couple of words. I mean, this election has been very hard fought between the two principal candidates, Jae-myung and Yoon Suk-yeo for the main opposition party. It's involved issues that have really been heart and center, if you like, of the debate amongst ordinary Koreans about wealth and income inequality, and also very important questions about continuity between the outgoing administration of Jae-in and whoever wins the election in 2 days' time. I'm sure we're going to want to talk about the state of democratic politics at a time, of course, when globally there are very important discussions about the strength and resilience of democracy as a system of governance at a time when we've seen authoritarian regimes challenging some of those hard-fought democratic principles. So this discussion today is not only about the election, but also about the broader context. But as I said, I'd like to hand over first to Eric to kick off our discussion. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, John. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'd like to use my brief time to give a rather bold interpretation of what we're seeing in this election. And I'd like to invite you to think about the election not as a contest in itself, but how it stands in relation to a deeper social struggle happening in South Korea. And I'd like to suggest that this is an election that pits hope versus hate, to put a simple label on it. We have two candidates who are closely aligned with either side of the country's major social struggle, which was alluded to actually in John's comments at the beginning. This is a struggle that has gained clarity in the past 6 years. It's between, on the one hand, forces that seek to deepen democracy, to cast off legacies of authoritarianism, to correct the related unjust privilege that some have gained, and to try to create opportunities for social mobility and to address many of the current problems that society faces. And on the other hand, forces that are digging in to resist that. The candlelight movement of 2016-17 was the moment that clarified the forces for hope. That movement, launched in the wake of revelations of serious wrongdoing by the then president, caught people's imagination, in part because it stimulated a positive, hopeful belief that government and society could be reordered to make life fairer and to create more opportunities for more people. The Democratic Party has tried in part to bottle the magic of that movement. Now, I think electoral politics can map poorly onto this sort of struggle. But candidate Jae-myung of the Democratic Party is among the Democratic Party figures who are closer, at least, to the spirit of the candlelight movement. There are others within the Democratic Party who are less close to it. So on one side of this election, we have a candidate who is relatively aligned with the hopeful side that has been so huge in Korean society since 2016. On the other side, we have candidate Yoon Suk-yeo, the former prosecutor, who is an even clearer figurehead for the forces that oppose hope. We might call these forces despair, but I think hope is a more accurate term. Despair may be driving some people to the hate. I use the term hate for three reasons. First, it has to do with the usual fear-mongering that parties on the side of Yoon Suk-yeo use today and have used in the past. Their position has long been that dialogue with North Korea is useless. But that's not simply a policy position, and it's not where the conversation ends. Rather, they tend to go further and denounce those who wish for dialogue and peace as enemies of the state. This is a long pattern in South Korea's politics. A second, and perhaps most important way that hate has worked its way into this contest has to do with events in 2019. In that year, we had an insurrection or rebellion against elected authority in order to protect the unaccountable power of the prosecutorial service. The Moon government at the time initiated moves to reform the prosecutor's office, and the prosecutor general at the time obstructed those moves by launching corruption investigations into the then justice minister. The episode really shook Korean society. We had big protests on the streets. Essentially, it was a cynical attempt to use trumped up claims of unfair benefits of a single individual and his family in order to block a reform effort that would make society in general fairer. The leader of that movement was now candidate Yoon Suk-yeo. That's how he became a politician. His platform is based on everything that happened in the autumn of 2019. What he represents is an attempt to strengthen these unfair, unreformed authoritarian elements of the Korean state. The third way in which this has become a contest of hope versus hate has to do with more recent events in 2021, 2022, in which previously fringe extremist views on issues such as gender have been taken and made mainstream by one camp in particular and by the media. I think I'll leave Professor Moon to elaborate further on this, but a basic interpretation, I think, could be that candidate Yoon and his colleagues have seized on frustration that the lofty aims of the candlelight movement have not been fully realized under the Moon Jae-in administration, and taken this really not just to throw the rascals out, but to fully invert the values of the candlelight movement. So in my reading here, we have an election that closely parallels this major struggle in Korean society between hope and hate. So I'll end my initial comments here. Thank you.
Eric, thank you for that very clear and, well, dare I say, unambiguous positioning on an issue that I'm sure is going to generate a lot of debate when we talk about in our discussion. What really provides a sense of legitimacy on the part of different political actors, either on the left or the right of the political spectrum. I'm sure we're going to want to come back and explore that, but I think you've given us some really interesting food to thought about this polarization that you've highlighted. And of course, I'm sure we're going to want to think comparatively also about how that compares to other polities where this division between what you might describe as almost Manichaean forces, plays out as a political dynamic. Kathy, let me turn to you now for your 3 minutes.
Thanks very much. And I don't think I will have the poetic capacity of Eric with the hope and hate trope, but I'm going to be more ambiguous, and in that sense, more of an equal opportunity critic. It'll come out more in our discussions probably. But let me just start by saying that both candidates, Mr. Lee of the Democratic Party and Mr. Yoon of the People's Party, the Conservative Party, the opposition party, have one basic commonality. They are completely inexperienced leaders on any national, regional, or international level. They are also the first candidates since Korea's democratization in the 80s to not have any experience in the National Assembly, in the legislature. They came into the public view very, very recently. It's as if they didn't exist and all of a sudden they existed. Mr. Lee, of course, had been governor of Gyeonggi province, a major province in Korea, and a mayor of a smaller city, but never had this kind of national, international limelight. And the inexperience shows up in their blunders, and frankly, in what I consider unclear, unfocused policy ideas and campaign issues. So my job today is to at least begin a conversation about some of these social issues that are politicized that Eric already has alluded to. And I highlight youth and women in particular as political forces in Korea, affecting, shaping the policy arenas. This election is the first time that 18-year-olds in Korea will be able to vote for president. Young people 18 through 39, but mostly 18 to 29 or so, have become a formidable group since 2016 to topple conservatives from power and make the ruling Democratic Party dominant at all levels of government, at the presidential, provincial, and local levels. They have had a lock on power. So that helps us, maybe helps us understand some of this popular opposition to the quote ruling party because of their multi-tiered power in Korean politics. The young people had fueled the impeachment of former President Pak Geun-Hye for violating state secrets and engaging in bribery and influence schemes to benefit her personal friend, Miss Che, in the amount of more than $70 million so that Miss Che's daughter could access elite university education as well as high-end equestrian facilities. Samsung's heir, another Mr. Lee, was also sent to jail along with President Park for his part in this corruption scheme. In 2017, young people propelled President Moon, the current president, to office and supported his campaign pledge to be a people-centered, that was his term, people-centered leader and an advocate of, quote, equal opportunity, fair process, and righteous result, end quote. He also declared that he would be the first feminist president. In some ways, even though these were words filled with hope back then, they have also come to bite him in the you-know-what and bite his party because so much of the animus, hostility against the Democratic Party, especially by young people, young men in particular, ages 18 to 29, who have turned anti-feminist. Over 70% of young men in that age group consider themselves anti-feminist. And in some ways, President Moon's hopeful declarations And then the sense of betrayal and disappointment by young people when the policies didn't work out helped set up this situation of extreme hostility in gender politics and the transformation of very young people into a major voting category. In recent years, corruption scandals involving top government officials and democratic leaders, as well as highly publicized cases of sexual assault and harassment by President Moon's close associates, these events have turned young people and women in particular away from the ruling party and the president. In April 21, during a special mayoral race, over 50% of youth voted for the Conservative Party in Seoul and Busan. The incumbents were of the Democratic Party, and this turn of events shocked the nation and shocked the Democratic Party that they are losing a stronghold in the young people group as voters. Both major candidates, Lee and Yoon, have been wooing young people, especially young men. They have been driving more divisiveness into politics, the candidates have, and they have been pandering to the young. And I can address some of the specific policy proposals that both candidates have come up with to pander to the young, especially to young men. This is the first election ever in Korea, and maybe ever in the world history, where misogyny, that term, misogyny, feminism, anti-feminism, have become central campaign issues. They're not substantive issues, but rhetorically, they take up a lot of media space as well as political air and energy. I will end there for now, and I will look forward to our discussions.
Kathy, thank you again for introducing themes which we're going to undoubtedly want to come back to. I think you've reminded us in some ways how different this election is from previous presidential contests that we've seen. So again, the theme of continuity and discontinuity, not only in terms of personalities, but the way in which this contest is playing out is going to be a very interesting thing for us to focus on. Let's move very swiftly to Christian, who's going to give us a foreign correspondent's perspective on the election. Christian, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, well, I think it's important to place this presidential election in the context of the presidency that is now coming to an end. Moon Jae-in is likely to have the highest approval rating of any elected president leaving office. It's currently around 40%. And he has achievements. COVID, I think, has been acknowledged as having been handled very well in South Korea. There's some wobbles at the moment in the Omicron phase, but total deaths in the whole pandemic are below 10,000. There's been no hard lockdown, and the economy has proven resilient and is bouncing back. By all accounts, Moon also handled the extremely challenging period of the Trump presidency pretty skillfully. And he's also conducted quite a subtle tilt towards America in the context of US-China competition, which is probably not given enough credit. So I would say that if his mandate had been from the electorate to that everything is going well in this country, and so keep a steady hand on the tiller, then his presidency, I think, would have fulfilled his mission and would have been deserving of praise. But of course, that wasn't his mandate. His mandate was for very comprehensive reform of the way that South Korea works. We've heard that in terms of the demand for comprehensive reform that was expressed through the candlelight movement. And I think this illustrates a paradox. This is a very successful country, especially when you think about it in historical terms, but it also has very serious problems. On that front, what has he achieved? I mean, I read recently his inauguration speech from 2017, and chaebol reform was a really central plank of Moon's promise to the electorate, precisely because Lee Jae-myung from the Samsung Air and Park Han-hye were jailed precisely because Lee Jae-won was bribing Park as part of a sort of spectacular series of scandals that we could maybe get into, but it's probably slightly old news now. And on chaebol reform, effectively nothing has been achieved at all. And that was sort of illustrated by the fact that Lee Jae-wye was let out early from prison precisely because Samsung was still regarded as so indispensable to deliver certain public goods in this context over the pandemic and manufacturers of chips and so on. Korea's political system, which Moon was pledged to reform, is clearly malfunctioning. I mean, these are, as someone on my piece said, these are the two worst candidates that South Korea has had in the democratic era. One minor party candidate put it very well when they described it as a choice between a drunk driver and a new driver, meaning that Lee Jae-myung from the Democratic Party didn't have the sufficient character and integrity to be a president, given his criminal convictions and various other skeletons that he has. Whereas, of course, there's a character issue over Yoon Suk-yeo as well, but there's also the fact that he's never held any elected office and he's simply not qualified to be a president. So Korea's political system, I think we can clearly say is malfunctioning. I've only been living in South Korea for 6 months, but I get the sense, and this is clearly expressed in the election as well, is that Korean society is malfunctioning to a certain extent as well. There's clearly great dissatisfaction, dislocation, both intergenerational tension and intragenerational tension between the genders, especially among the young. The situation facing women is simply not being addressed. And there are other issues surrounding atomization, which is often manifested in painful experiences for the elderly in South Korea, which I think is something that is actually a really big social problem, but doesn't get very much attention. Related to social problems is Korea's economic problems. One person told me when I was researching this, reporting ahead of this election was, well, look at the Korean economy. You can't say it's malfunctioning. Look at its GDP growth and so on, how it's bounced back. Well, just because it's performing well at a macro level doesn't mean that problems are not building up. I think there's clearly a problem with economic overconcentration, both in terms of chaebol power and in terms of how Seoul relates to the rest of the country. There's an unaddressed demographic problem, pensions being the most obvious thing, but it won't be the only manifestation of that. And we have serious generational regional inequality, which is being expressed in this dissatisfaction in democratic politics at the moment. And a sort of final area, which maybe doesn't get that much attention, is I would argue that Korea's diplomacy is also malfunctioning. Not necessarily the positions which South Korea adopts, but Moon's pursuit of a so-called end of war declaration with North Korea over the final couple of years of his presidency, I would describe as quixotic, bordering on delusional. He devoted diplomatic capital attempting to get the Pope to go to Pyongyang, which, if you'll express the pun, I regard as the ultimate Hail Mary, diplomatically speaking. And I would describe his diplomacy in the post-Trump era, at least, as almost a kind of Tinkerbell diplomacy, based on what he wishes to be the case, rather than any sort of desire to achieve concrete goals, other than a kind of mercantilist pursuit of traditional national interests. And these weaknesses have been exposed by the Russia crisis. I think South Korea has been regarded by several allies as having been timid and passive on this crisis, and that this reflects a wider lack of confidence in articulating and manifesting South Korea's very clear and obvious assets, which it should bring to the region. BTS bringing a K-pop band to the UN is not a foreign policy. So the question to me is, this is not actually necessarily a great condemnation of President Moon. I think it raises a very important question, which is a thing that I've been wrestling with, which is, okay, if South Korea if the Moon presidency has been a period of unfulfilled reform, was that simply a question of a failure of will or leadership from the president? Or are there actually more structural forces that are obstructing this reform from taking place? The structures of government, the political system, that make this country actually very, very difficult to reform in any meaningful way. And if that's the case, that's actually an even bigger problem than who the president is. Because you could have a good president, you could have a bad president, but if problems keep getting stored up from presidency to presidency, then the bigger picture is not as optimistic for South Korea as I think it should be, given its manifest virtues and assets.
Christian, thank you for, again, each of you has given very hard-hitting analyses of what you see as the current state of politics. And in the interest of trying to see whether we can meet somewhere in the middle, I'm going to deliberately play devil's advocate and come back to each of you and challenge your assertions, because I think it's a really important part of the discussion that we're going to have, and I'm sure with our audience. Eric, beginning with you, your sort of hope versus hate binary. I can see the circumstances in which, particularly because of the rhetoric of politics that we've seen played out in this campaign, especially, it is very tempting to sort of position both sides of the political spectrum in those rather black and white terms. But I'm also struck when we look back on past Conservative candidates and past Conservative presidents, how much of an appetite there's been by Conservative politicians to embrace a much more consensual type of approach to politics. When I think of candidate Pak Geun-Hye, when she won the presidency in 2013, she talked about welfare policies that were very ambitious. She talked about being a uniter, not a divider. She talked, if you like, about reaching out to both sides of the political aisle. And one can think also of candidate Lee Myung-bak talking in similar terms. And in fact, it's been observed in this campaign that the pledge on the part of candidate Lee to raise the standard of the South Korean economy to the 5th largest economy in the world is taking a line, if you like, out of Lee Myung-bak's playbook. So I wonder whether there's a tendency perhaps to be too explicit in highlighting this division, and it misses the extent to which politicians, including, I would say, both candidates, if you think about their position on welfare issues, are actually trying to play for the centre ground in terms of their actual substantive policies. The other fact that I think is quite striking is how close this election is. And we've seen the Conservative candidate, at least polls obviously have closed in terms, because we need to ensure that, or the system requires that voters not be influenced by public opinion polls, but the final set of polls put it at about a 3% margin between the two candidates. And there seems to be, therefore, a resurgence in Conservative support. So if there is so much of this demonizing approach to politics currently going on, how do we explain the fact that Conservative candidates still seem to be able to secure a substantial amount of support from the electorate? To Kathy, your observations, I think, in a sense, lead on from that curious fact. You know, we saw in the Busan and Seoul mayoral elections, as you said, the strength of support now for Conservative candidates. Maybe it's a reaction to the disappointment between the high rhetoric of candidate Moon and his difficulties in delivering, as you suggested in your remarks. But I also want to ask the question about the resilience and viability of political institutions. Is this a fundamental problem with the nature of the presidency itself? A single-term presidency means that all candidates effectively are lame ducks the moment they're elected. And therefore they're confronted by this basic challenge of simply not having enough political space and time in which to deliver on these bold promises. A second question to you, Kathy, and again to all of our panelists really, is when we think about the historical divisions between left and right, so much of it is often shaped around identity politics, about discussions about what defines the left and what defines the right. The left in terms of the battle for democracy, the right in terms of the miracle on the Han River. Has that type of identity politics become less relevant in thinking about contemporary issues? Are we seeing, if anything, again, a willingness on both the part of conservative and progressive voters to move away from those familiar themes? And finally, to Christian, alongside all of the examples that you highlighted of difficulties in the current political system, South Korea, of course, was invited along with Australia and India to be a participant in the G7 as part of this so-called D10. Many people would say that's testament to its newfound global prominence, its success in being able to deliver a global agenda, not just a regional agenda, moving outside the framework of North Korea. So whatever we think about President Moon's management of the North Korean issue, and some would argue he's been a very influential catalyst in getting larger players like the United States to engage with North Korea. On broader issues, the new Southern policy, on climate change, on supply chain resilience, South Korea has shown itself willing to play a much more activist role in international politics. So does that ameliorate, does that leaven, if you like, the criticism that the institutions of government and the politicians themselves are not performing at the highest level? And then linked to that, the kind of broader comparative question for all of you. You know, we've seen the emergence of populist politics. Is Korea any different from the United States or France, or for that matter, the United Kingdom, in terms of the willingness of politicians increasingly to take polarizing positions? Because that's simply the way in which you secure sufficient support to get elected. Are we all populists now? In whatever democratic system we look at, there is this tendency to move to the extremes. And should we be surprised? And should we therefore be perhaps less critical of what's happening in Korea because it's part of a global trend? So some ideas for all of us to think about. Let me start with Eric and invite your views, and not just in terms of those questions, but perhaps if you also would like to reflect on your other fellow panelists' presentations. Eric, starting with you.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, John, for those questions. And I'll start by addressing the question of change or continuity with the past, and how previous presidential candidates have positioned themselves. I think it's also important to recognize that the People's Power Party, that line of political parties, it has come back from the ashes. In the wake of the fall of Pak Geun-hye, or even before she fell, the party was completely smashed. It split in two. Her politicians who were on her side didn't know what to do. We could have seen some realignment, perhaps, in South Korea's party politics. I think that many party politicians on that side at that time expected that they would have to make really fundamental changes if they were going to remain relevant in Korean society. Nonetheless, somehow the party reformed and has kind of struck back with this kind of left field candidate in Yoon Suk-yeo. And they've had to take a lot of risks in getting back into the political landscape. I think they were so much on the margins that they had to take these big risks. One, with having Yoon end up as their candidate, and then with kind of the embrace of basically far-right positions, embracing positions on gender that were only openly espoused by a very fringe far-right groups just a couple of years ago. They've taken these major risks, and at least according to polls and in the by-election that was mentioned from last year, these have paid off. So they have taken some risks, and by becoming more divisive, by calling out to fringe elements, and they've paid off. I think perhaps the Democratic Party and candidate Jae-myung, and this is not to defend or say that they're taking the right approach, perhaps what they're trying to do is figure out, do we need to play this game as well? Has the game we've played so far of talking about aspirations of things like the candlelight movement, is this not enough? Do we need to also get into the more dirtier side? Perhaps this is what they're thinking about. So I'd like to put it in that context of that whole side of party politics really being smashed in 2016-17. I'd like to also say something partly in response to your questions, partly in response to some of the other panelists' comments on the state of Korean democracy. Well, part of the reason that we can be so critical about what we see in Korea is that it's an open society. There is, media can report and do report whatever they feel like. So there are many societies out there where we cannot be so critical because we do not have an open media. We don't get the information. We don't feel that frustration. A second aspect is that Koreans are good at complaining. There is, from the authoritarian period, there is a culture of expressing dissent eloquently and in a way that is seen as legitimate. And so these expressions of frustration with authority come out very, very fluently in Korea. And third, the broadcast and news media has seized on this and used it to fire in all directions. Right? So we have, I could say very critical things about the broadcast and print media landscape, but they are actively creating scandals and pushing things in a more divisive direction. I will say, by the way, I don't think Korea is actually a polarized society. The kind of struggle that I describe, I think, is one between a majority that is on the more hopeful side and a real numerical minority that is on the side of hate, if you will. The question that Christian asked at the end, I kind of agree a bit with the latter suggestion that he had, that there are entrenched structures in Korea that are very difficult to reform. This is a post-colonial, post-authoritarian society, and practicing democracy in that context is extremely difficult. It's not just a matter of having scandal-free politicians or not having corruption. It's a matter of trying to address some of those institutions, some of those relationships, those power structures that were established in the authoritarian period. Some of those were reformed, some were demolished, but others stand and continue and can even claim a measure of legitimacy. And this makes the task of doing democracy in South Korea really a challenge. And this brings me to the last point. Despite all that we're talking about bringing in extremist views and horrible candidates saying horrible things that we would not expect to be said in South Korea or another democracy, I think there's still reason to be hopeful about South Korea's democracy. If we look at democracy worldwide over the past 5, 7, 8 years, there has been massive cynicism in all of the places that were bastions of democracy. And I think for much of that period, we've seen the very opposite in South Korea. We see people getting together and trying to use collective action to do hopeful things. We see people gathering peacefully in order to demand justice and to hold their leaders to account. Electoral politics brings out the worst in Korea's politics. There is a lot more to Korea's politics than its electoral politics, and that's where it's so positive. What is remarkable is when you ride the bus in Seoul, you have the radio playing, and it is political news and political commentary at the highest level. If you peer over the shoulders of the young people who are on the subway, they are watching YouTube channels that are political, or they're listening to podcasts that are political. This is the real political engagement, and the level of analysis that happens there is simply phenomenal. So what I see is a society that has some real democratic maturity at a mass level, but it also has all these other things that we're talking about.
Eric, that's really helpful. A footnote rather than a question, again, for us to keep thinking about in the limited time that we have. Your point about institutions, raises questions about the viability of parties. Why do parties come and go and change so rapidly in Korea? And on your issue about the kind of engagement with politics, I agree. How much of that, however, gets cramped, if you like, by an absence of trusting the other side, whether it's a majority or a minority? And where does that distrust, if there is distrust in Korean politics, come from? Something for us to consider. Kathy, your thoughts, please.
Thanks so much for your really smart questions. And Eric, that was really brilliant. I appreciate. I'm going to have to use some of those words you mentioned as quotes that ring in my head. John, you asked me two questions. One about the institutional aspects of the 5-year term presidency in South Korea as inherently limiting real substantive change based on campaign promises. I'll direct my answer there first. Yes, the simple answer is yes, there are substantial substantive institutional constraints. 5 years is a short period of time for a person to get used to, adjusted to that kind of office and to break ground on policy issues, and then try to get the political process, implementation, et cetera, in place. What we need to keep in mind, though, is that there is a rationale that made sense for a 5-year term in South Korean politics. With democratization came the 5-year term, and it is a direct legacy of authoritarian politics, dictatorship in South Korea, where the longest ruling leader, Pak Geun-hye, the father of former President Pak Geun-hye. Pak Geun-hye stayed in office for about 18 years and kept manipulating election laws in order to pushing basically barehandedly the legal system to stay in office. We know about this in so many other places. Russia is one of them. I say that because it's so much in our heads right now and in our hearts regarding Ukraine. So the 5-year term did make sense for a time. The question now that you raise is, does it make sense going into the future? And that's something to be debated. But I would say in South Korea, it's not just the 5-year term that limits the capacity of presidents to do real things. It's also these grand campaign promises that they make. Every single president, every single candidate running for president comes up with the earth, the oceans, the sky, outer space. It is just a phenomenal set of ideas that they put out there, raising the expectations of the public. I mean, it's one thing to say that corruption has been an awful thing in the President Park Geun-hye presidency, that this is a shameful, disgraceful situation for South Korea, internally and externally. It's another thing to say that I, Moon Jae-in, will reform the entire chaebol system. I mean, it's not even possible. Where do you take the first step? So I think South Korean leaders need to focus on the nitty-gritty, functional, practical issues, and also help educate and lead the public to focus on very nitty-gritty specific issues rather than the pie in the sky ideas about, quote, change. The second is that corruption, in my view, massive corruption at the very top, is significantly the force that shapes and limits the South Korean presidency. Every single president, prior to democracy and after democracy, has been plagued with phenomenal, I use that word again, you know, this corruption on a massive scale. It shocks the nation. It creates such distrust and cynicism, and it basically scuttles the legitimacy of the presidency and makes it impossible to do, quote, real work. The third thing I'll say here, you alluded to this in your comments after our presentations, John. Oh, I'm sorry. No, it was actually Christian who referred to this. You know, reform politics, people want it at the top, but is this something that is much more deeply rooted and needed in terms of transforming from bottom up? And I would say, yes, South Korea has so many problems. I would say starting out with the educational system. It's an all or nothing society. And as many observers note, the South Korean presidency is an all or nothing game. So the presidency is a very strong executive force with not as many checks and balances as we might see in some other democracies. And so when people get into power, they want to have it all, and they want to punish those who came before them if they're from the opposition. And I would say this kind of mentality mirrors what goes on in the lower reaches from grade school on, of children vying for good schools, vying constantly but for good test scores. And then, of course, at the university level, students, young people, teenagers sacrifice so much of their childhood and lives to get into a good university. And it's a make or break thing, as you know. If you don't make it into a good school, you're dead at age 17, 18, 19. And so that also shapes people's sense of hope or hate or despair. And so they seek this all-out change, but that change can't come just from the top. You also asked about left-right identity politics. Is this something that is still in vogue among the younger generation? Is it passing? I would say it is in transition to passing eventually. Mm-hmm. And there's a recent book by some young people in South Korea that addresses this. I don't recall the title right now, but they talk about the industrialists, the industrializing generation, then the democratizing generation, and that these two generations are old generations. So President Jae-in is from the democratizing generation. President Pak Geun-hye, former President Pak Geun-hye, of course, was of the industrializing modernizing generation. The old guard is on its way out. I'm not that much younger than President Moon, so it's kind of sad to put it that way. And John, I'll put you in my category. But there is a real generation, not only divide, but generational transition that is about to take place. For a lot of young people in their 20s and 30s, the left-right is very limiting, and they don't see eye to eye with the old guard who says they're left or right. So I think we might need to redefine left and right in South Korea. But having said that, I will add that the left-right identity is very much not only about social welfare issues and democracy and human rights versus free market, et cetera, but it's also primarily about North Korea. This is historical context for this divide. And what's very interesting and curious is that the very young generation of subgeneration of men, the 20-somethings, in this period with gender politics, misogyny, and all becoming big campaign issues, they are moving toward a more hawkish stance toward North Korea. And this is important because the youth vote, the youth as a group was basically what the Democratic Party and its predecessor parties, the left, had owned. From President Roh Moo-hyun on in the early 2000s, people really thought the youth were going to the left. And now we're seeing some obvious divisions, as we've all talked about, but also even some divisions among the very young men going more hawkish, hardline right in this political climate.
Kathy, thank you. I mean, that reminds me, of course, that we've seen similar trends in other polities, right? Observations that younger voters have become, certainly at least until the tragic events we're seeing unfold in Ukraine, more predisposed towards a type of authoritarianism, however we label it. Christian, I'm conscious we don't have a great deal of time, and I know we have questions from the audience that I want to share with you. So can I ask you for your thoughts very quickly at this stage?
Yes, very quickly. In terms of whether criticizing South Korea's diplomacy is unfair, you mentioned President Moon being invited to the G7. That's absolutely correct. But this was recognition of the country's potential as a global actor and a recognition of its historic achievements, which I mentioned. But whether it's yet prepared to live up to this potential really remains to be seen. I'll just give very quickly a couple of examples. Yes, as you mentioned, President Moon made a pledge to cut emissions by 50%, but only after Japan and China made their pledges first. South Korea also announced its intention to apply to join the CPTPP, which, by the way, story broken by the FT, but only after China and Taiwan announced their intentions. And even now, we're not sure if it's actually going to happen. You need a PhD to understand where precisely South Korea stands on the US-China confrontation. Obviously, this is a complex issue, but still, it's a terrible mystery that requires incredible amount of interrogation to see where the country really stands on this. The response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, South Korea had to be dragged to its current position of condemning the invasion and joining sanctions and so on. And even now, it's unclear what, if anything, it's actually doing beyond reluctantly agreeing to comply with sanctions that other countries have imposed. And I can tell you as a foreign correspondent, its leaders do not effectively broadcast their policy or their values or their ambitions or their fears to the world. And I, as I said before, I don't know if, I'm not saying the public diplomacy is bad, it just doesn't even seem to exist. And I think the country is still hiding behind soft power rather than actually adopting a coherent position on these key issues and broadcasting to the world and getting influence from them. I mean, I think it's much less influential than it could and should be.
Okay, thank you, Christian. Let me now take the opportunity to engage with some of our questions from the audience. And can I encourage, in the little time we have left, if there are more questions, do put them into the Q&A section. Starting actually in reverse order with Christian first, if I may, and to pick up the issue of foreign policy. James Kaizuka asks, do you think that attitudes towards Japan and the United States are important when we think about the current politics? And then to Kathy, how do you characterize South Korean feminism? Do you see any notable difference, CK Har asks, between South Korean feminism and feminism in the West, particularly in the United States? And last, a question that I'll direct to Eric, if I may, but to all of you really. Luca Battalini asks, what role will economics play in the elections? For instance, the real estate market. And we haven't really talked about that question. So it's, as a key issue in the election, how important is it? So perhaps beginning with Christian, if I may.
Yes, so the US and Japan do play, I think, an important role in a sense. They're expressed in Korea's political divide. I mean, for historical reasons, won't necessarily go into, but the Korean right is historically much more overtly pro-American and conciliatory towards Japan, whereas the Korean left is partly because of America's role in supporting the successive authoritarian regimes, is a bit more skeptical about the United States' presence on the peninsula and prefers to pursue a more independent line. And from a sort of nationalist perspective, is much less conciliatory with Japan. So those, I think, those things get manifested in successive sort of generations of presidential contests. What I say is the really interesting factor is South Korean approach to China. And there's been a very clear deterioration in how South Koreans perceive China. And interestingly, different generations have got different reasons for doing this. And don't worry, I won't take too long. There's a kind of pincer movement, of a sort of anti-Chinese sentiment pincer movement, where the old, who have a more traditionally sort of Cold War memory and Cold War articulation of the world, of global politics, are very hawkish on China. But they're being joined by the younger generation who are very, see China very negatively in more sort of straightforwardly moral terms, especially when they see people, young people with whom they identify with in, for example, Hong Kong, and how they were treated by China in the last few years. And you have this middle section of the sort of middle-aged Koreans who grew up in the last couple of decades really benefiting from this boom in trade with China, and who are a lot more reticent about criticizing China, about confronting China. But this middle group, which is more identified with the Democratic Party, is being squeezed. So yeah, I think this is something that is going to be a relevant factor for whichever president wins on Wednesday.
Thank you, Christian. Kathy.
Okay, you've given us a lot. I think with South Korea, we are looking at a situation. First, a note on foreign policy, following Christian's comments. Both candidates do not have foreign policy experience, as I noted in the beginning, but they do have some significant differences, at least in the way that their handlers, the advisors, have written up and framed their positions. Candidate Yoon from the Conservative Party is much more in line with what we normally think of as conservative foreign policy in South Korea, pro-US, but also being more clear that he would want Korea to engage in, participate in, actually his word, trilateral cooperation, that's South Korea, Japan, and the US. And I say that because when Christian mentioned, that there's no public diplomacy, I would say there is a public diplomacy that's aimed against Japan. That's been at play in South Korea now for a long time. They're obsessed. South Korean diplomats are obsessed with trying to catch up, if not best, Japan's successful public diplomacy around the world. But the fact that Yoon has come out and said he wants more structured discussions, consultation with Japan and the US, and a trilateral participation, I think is a positive sign. Hopefully South Korea can go in that direction no matter who wins. On the feminism, it's a tough question, and the answer is it will be murkier than the questioner would like, because this is my professorial hat. There are many feminisms in any society, not just one feminism. Okay, but the main difference, I think, for South Korean regarding South Korean feminism, as compared to, let's say, what I know best, American feminism, is that it is less about sexual identity, gender identities, less about transsexuals and LGBT. Those are not the mainstream issues in South Korean feminism. It still has a conventional veneer, much more about men, traditional conventional men versus women, much more about equal opportunity, despite whatever the government has done to try to increase women's access to all sorts of all aspects of life. Still, women bear the brunt of the discrimination. It's about job security, promotion, not being forced out when you get pregnant, when you get married, let alone pregnant. And also about the kinds of extra burdens that women carry as daughters-in-law, for example. I mean, that's a whole nother job category that women bear in South Korea that nobody talks about. So it's more conventional. Having said that, the more contemporary aspects of the complex gender identities that are coloring feminist politics or anti-feminist politics around the world, they're present. I forgot to mention something very important in the conventional world of feminism is the Me Too movement. South Korea's Me Too movement has been very powerful, and there's a lot of passion around trying to get women justice for the rampant sexual harassment, assault, violence that they face. And I had alluded to this in my presentation. High-ranking Democratic Party officials recently were outed by women, people who worked on the staffs of these elected officials, for the sexual harassment and assault that they had experienced. And it destroyed the former Korean mayor's life. He took his own life after the allegations. It booted out the Busan mayor. So these are very hot and very important issues.
Kathy, thank you very much. Moving on swiftly to Eric, because we really are over time, but you have the last word. If you just want to address perhaps that economic issue and any other remaining thoughts you might have.
Just quickly, I'll say a couple of things. First, I think that Korea is not the U.S. in terms of populism and polarization. You get to that place through particular individuals taking you there. In Korea, we have an individual and some colleagues, plus the complicity of the media trying to take the country in that direction. It's not there yet. Second, I'll just say on foreign policy briefly, there has been a change in thinking in the Moon administration and with a kind of progressive side of South Korea's politics that kind of underlies the end of war declaration attempt. And now, even though we haven't got something from that, there has been in the past 18 months or 2 years, really a commitment to building a peace regime, whereas progressives previously justified their approach to North Korea in terms of ethnic solidarity, in terms of achieving unification. Now the word is peace, and that is a major shift. You hear public intellectuals, some people in government speaking on these terms, and so that's a major change. Finally, Luca's question on the real estate market. Economics is important. The real estate market is perhaps one of the most important issues here. But what's key to the politics is how people imagine it. How do people imagine their economic condition? Why is it that I'm not able to get the house that I think I should be able to get? And that gets back to the issues that Catherine brought up of education, of how the expectations people were given as kids, and of gender relations. So it's really a question of how these economic conditions are imagined, I think. Thanks.
Eric, your point about imagination, I think, is a useful way on which to try and end positively. Because I think there are positive things that have come out of our discussion, which are worth highlighting. You know, Kathy, you talked about corruption, and you also talked about the social pressures, in a sense, that make people fight in a very immediate sense to succeed. And that sort of energy, of course, has been part of South Korea's success economically, and in terms of achieving so many of the kind of quantitative progress that they've been able to demonstrate, which I think partly explains that decision to invite them to participate in the G7. But it comes with a downside, which is that level of competition perhaps makes people tempted to stretch the rules, to find shortcuts, and that's a very human reaction. The second point, perhaps also to come back to Christian's observations, I hesitate to say that geography is destiny, but where Korea sits and the sort of environment, we didn't really talk much about those sort of environmental constraints, is a huge factor, surely, in explaining why the challenges that South Korean presidents, politicians, voters face when thinking about foreign and domestic policy are so real, and perhaps arguably bigger than other countries. How many countries have to face the existential threat of a nuclear neighbor? How many of them have to face great power competition in the region and globally, as well as dealing with the other kind of issue that affects the public imagination, which is the legacy of history? The last sort of positive point I want to end on for us to think about, however, is that for all of the problems that we've discussed, we are seeing dramatic evidence. People are voting with their feet and showing up at the polling booths and participating in the political process. And I think that's a very positive note on which to end. And it echoes Eric's point that however much we might talk about populism as a kind of pathological condition affecting so many political systems, it's not inevitable, and it depends on voters getting engaged. And I think South Korea is a very constructive example of how that level of engagement should be a source of optimism, not only in Korea, but in other countries. Let me thank you all for sharing your insights, for having a very stimulating and illuminating discussion about a political environment that is so important. Thank you to the audience for participating. I'm sorry we weren't able to bring more of you into our discussion, but I hope you found it illuminating and rewarding. Watch the polls closely. We will report back, I'm sure, once the election is over and give you our Chatham House commentary on some of these developments. But thank you again, wherever you've been, for watching and listening to this very stimulating panel. Thank you all, and see you again soon, I hope.